The faint hum of the gas station buzzed in the background, a steady rhythm interrupted only by the occasional ding of a car pulling up to the pumps. Mr. Harris stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a practiced hand. To anyone who glanced, his way, he was just another part-time worker, unremarkable, forgettable. But Mr. Harris wasn't who he appeared to be. He owned this station, and for the past few weeks he had been working undercover, blending in with his staff to see things from the ground up. It was his way of understanding the challenges his team faced and spotting problems before they spiraled out of control. Tonight, however, his instincts were on high alert. Reports of fuel thefts and vandalism had been plaguing nearby towns, and Harris had noticed the subtle signs that his station might be next. A loose lock on the storage shed, graffiti scrawled hastily on the back wall. These were warnings he couldn't ignore. He had a feeling something was about to go down, and he needed to be ready. The door chimed, snapping Harris out of his thoughts. 2 teenagers walked in, their presence immediately catching his attention. They didn't look like trouble at first glance, just 2 boys, maybe 16 or 17. One was tall and lanky, with a nervous energy about him, while the other was shorter and stockier, his demeanor more confident. But there was something about the way they moved, the way they exchanged hurried whispers, that made Harris's guard go up. The taller one, Ben, scanned the shelves as if looking for something, but Harris noticed his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. The stockier boy, Kyle, nudged him impatiently, his expression tense. They stopped near the soda fridge, huddled close, their voices dropping to a murmur. Harris didn't want to stare, so he picked up a stack of receipts and moved toward the cash register, keeping his movements casual. From there, he could catch snippets of their conversation. "I'm telling you, we're not ready," Ben said, his voice low but insistent. "This is stupid. We don't have a choice," Kyle shot back, his tone sharper. "Do you want to deal with what happens if we don't?" Harris frowned. What could 2 teenagers possibly be so worried about? Their words didn't sound like the typical banter of kids sneaking snacks or planning pranks. No, this was different, darker. Kyle opened the soda fridge and pulled out a bottle, holding it absently as he leaned closer to Ben. "We've got everything we need. It's not that complicated." "It's dangerous," Ben countered, his voice shaking slightly. "What if it goes wrong?" "It won't," Kyle said, his tone softening but the edge of tension still there. "We've been over this. Just stick to the plan." Harris's instincts were buzzing now. Something about the boys' demeanor, the urgency in their voices, didn't sit right. He decided to make his presence known. With deliberate slowness, he stepped out from behind the counter and started restocking a nearby display of chips. "Evening," he said casually, glancing their way. The boys froze, their conversation halting abruptly. Ben's face went pale, and he clutched his soda bottle like it was a lifeline. Kyle, however, recovered quickly, flashing a tight smile. "Hey!" Kyle said, his voice steady, but his eyes darting toward the door. Harris nodded, pretending to focus on the chips, but his mind was racing. What were these boys planning, and why did it feel like something much bigger than a simple prank? As the boys moved toward the counter to pay for their drinks, Harris kept a close eye on them. He couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to take a dangerous turn. The words, black and racism, lingered in the back of his mind, though he wasn't sure why. Something about the boys' conversation had triggered a deeper unease, one that went beyond the immediate situation. The door chimed again as the boys left, their footsteps fading into the night. Harris watched them go, his instincts screaming at him to follow, but he stayed put, knowing that whatever was about to happen, he needed to be ready. The gas station was quiet once more, but the tension in the air was palpable. Harris knew this was just the beginning. Something dark was brewing, and he was determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. The tension escalates as Mr. Harris observes Kyle and Ben leaving the gas station. Their nervous behavior and hurried exit confirm his suspicions that they are involved in something serious. Harris decides to follow them, driven by his instincts and a sense of responsibility. The atmosphere remains tense, with a focus on Harris's internal conflict and the mystery surrounding the boys' actions. The faint chime of the gas station door echoed in Mr. Harris's ears as Kyle and Ben disappeared into the night. Their hurried steps and whispered urgency left behind an unease that clung to him like a shadow. Whatever they were up to, it wasn't harmless. The signs were all there, the nervous glances, the hushed tones, the palpable fear. Harris stood by the counter, his eyes fixed on the darkened street beyond the glass doors. His instincts were tugging at him, whispering that this was a thread he needed to pull. These boys weren't troublemakers by nature. Something, or someone, was pushing them toward whatever ill-advised plan they were about to enact. With a quiet resolve, Harris grabbed his jacket from the back room. If his years of experience had taught him anything, it was that trouble didn't resolve itself by waiting. He had to act. The evening air was crisp as Harris stepped outside, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights from the station humming behind him. In the distance, he spotted the teenagers under the dim glow of a street lamp. They were walking quickly, their heads bent close in conversation, with the occasional anxious glance thrown over their shoulders. Harris kept a safe distance, sticking to the shadows as he followed them. His footsteps were light, his breathing steady. The streets of Ridgewood were quiet at this hour, the occasional car passing by with its headlights cutting through the darkness. Harris moved with purpose, his eyes never leaving the boys. He noticed how Ben kept fidgeting, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, while Kyle walked with a determined stride, though his shoulders were tense. Whatever they were planning, it was clear that Ben was reluctant, while Kyle seemed to be the driving force. As they turned a corner, Harris quickened his pace, careful not to make a sound. The boys stopped near an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. Harris's heart sank. This wasn't good. He crouched behind a parked car, watching as Kyle pulled something from his backpack, a small, dark object that Harris couldn't quite make out. Ben hesitated, his face pale under the dim light. "We don't have to do this," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "There's still time to back out." Kyle shook his head, his expression grim. "It's too late for that. We're in too deep." Harris's mind raced. What were they planning to do? Break into the warehouse? Steal something? Or was it something worse? He couldn't just stand by and let them make a mistake that could ruin their lives. But he also couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. He needed to know more. As the boys approached the warehouse door, Harris pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo. He then sent a text to his security team, alerting them to the situation. If things escalated, he wanted backup ready, but for now, he would handle this himself. The sound of a metal door creaking open broke the silence. Kyle and Ben slipped inside, their figures disappearing into the darkness. Harris waited a moment before following, his heart pounding in his chest. The warehouse was dimly lit, with only the faint glow of a flashlight cutting through the shadows. Harris moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. Inside, the boys were rummaging through a pile of crates, their movements frantic. Harris could hear them whispering, though their words were too muffled to make out. He edged closer, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. That's when he saw it, a stack of fuel canisters, their labels warning of flammability. His blood ran, cold. They're planning to steal fuel, Harris realized, his mind racing. But why? And who was behind this? Before he could process the thought, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Ben had knocked over a crate, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Kyle cursed under his breath, his flashlight swinging wildly. "We need to hurry!" Kyle hissed, his voice sharp with panic. Harris knew he had to act. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "Stop right there!" The boys froze, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. Kyle's flashlight beam landed on Harris, illuminating his stern expression. "Mr. Harris," Ben stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Kyle demanded, his tone defensive, but laced with unease. Harris crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here?" The boys exchanged a glance, their silence speaking volumes. Harris took a step closer, his voice softening. "Whatever you're involved in, it's not too late to walk away, but you need to tell me what's going on." Ben looked like he was about to break, his eyes filled with guilt and fear, but Kyle's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," Kyle said, his voice low. "We don't have a choice." Harris frowned. "There's always a choice. Now tell me, who's making you do this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. For a moment it seemed like Kyle might open up, but then the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse, and the boys' faces went pale. "They're here," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Harris turned, his instincts screaming at him to prepare for the worst. The shadows at the far end of the warehouse shifted, and a figure emerged, a tall, imposing man with a cold, calculating gaze. "Well, well," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "Looks like we've got company." Harris's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about stolen fuel. It was something much bigger and much more dangerous. The streets of Ridgewood were quiet at this hour, the usual small-town stillness, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the rumble of a passing car. The boys turned down a side street, their pace quickening. Harris hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning for any potential onlookers. Satisfied he wasn't being watched, he continued, his movements careful and deliberate. The teenagers stopped at a small park on the outskirts of town. A single lamppost cast a pale circle of light over a weathered bench where the boys sat down. Harris ducked behind a large oak tree, crouching low to stay out of sight. From his vantage point, he could hear snippets of their conversation. "We don't have much time," Kyle said, his voice sharp. "We've got to figure this out now." Ben rubbed his hands together, the nerves evident in his jittery movements. I don't want to mess this up. What if something goes wrong?" Kyle exhaled loudly, the sound heavy with frustration. "It won't. We've gone over it 100 times. Stop second-guessing everything." Harris's gaze shifted to the piece of paper Ben pulled from his jacket. Under the lamplight, he could see it was a hand-drawn map of some kind, complete with notations and arrows. Ben pointed to one of the marks, saying something Harris couldn't quite catch. The conversation was tense, but before Harris could lean in closer, the low growl of an engine broke through the quiet. A rusted pickup truck pulled into the park, its headlights casting harsh beams that danced across the tree trunks. Harris ducked lower, his pulse quickening. The driver's side door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was rough-looking, with a lean build and a scar running from his temple to his cheek. A cigarette dangled from his lips, and his movements were deliberate, exuding a quiet menace. "Rick," Kyle said, standing up quickly. "We've got it under control," Ben added, his voice shaky. Rick snapped, his voice sharp and gravelly. "I don't want excuses. You two screw up again, and it's not just you who'll be dealing with me. Got it?" Ben nodded rapidly, his hands trembling. Kyle tried to hold his ground, but Harris could see the boy's bravado faltering under Rick's piercing gaze. Rick tossed a folded piece of paper at Kyle, who barely caught it before it hit the ground. "That's your next job. Simple enough. Even you two can't mess it up." Kyle unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly. "Tampering with the pump? That's risky." Rick took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the dim light. "Risk is my business. You do what I tell you, and nobody gets hurt. Screw it up, and I'll make sure your families wish you'd never been born. Clear?" Ben looked like he was about to cry, but Kyle clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "We'll do it," Rick sneered, flicking his cigarette to the ground. You better. He turned back toward his truck but paused, glancing over his shoulder. And don't think about running. I've got eyes everywhere. You even think about skipping town and you'll regret it. With that, Rick climbed into the truck and roared off into the night, leaving the boys standing in his wake, pale and shaken. Harris remained crouched behind the tree, his mind racing. Rick. He'd heard the name whispered in town before, always, in hushed tones. Fuel thefts, vandalism, intimidation. Rick was behind it all, running his operations like a shadowy puppeteer, and now he was using these kids to do his dirty work. The boys stood there for a moment longer, Kyle clutching the folded paper like it was a death sentence. Ben looked like he was on the verge of breaking down. Harris knew he couldn't just stand by and let this happen. These boys were in over their heads, and Rick was a predator who thrived on fear and control. As the boys began to walk away, Harris stepped out from behind the tree, his voice calm but firm. Kyle, Ben, the boys froze, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. "Mr. Harris," Ben stammered. "What are you doing here?" Kyle demanded, his tone defensive but laced with unease. Harris crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here? And who is Rick?" The boys exchanged a glance, their silence speaking volumes. Harris took a step closer, his voice softening. "Whatever you're involved in, it's not too late to walk away. But you need to tell me what's going on." Ben looked like he was about to break, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. But Kyle's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," Kyle said, his voice low. "We don't have a choice." Harris frowned. "There's always a choice. Now tell me, what did Rick give you?" Kyle hesitated, then handed over the folded paper. Harris unfolded it, his eyes, scanning the crude map and the instructions scrawled in messy handwriting. His heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. "This isn't just about stealing fuel, is it?" Harris asked, his voice grave. Kyle shook his head, his bravado crumbling. "It's bigger than that. And if we don't do what he says, he'll hurt our families." Harris's jaw tightened. He knew he couldn't let this go. Rick was a dangerous man, and these boys were just pawns in his game. But if Harris was going to stop him, he'd need to act fast and carefully. "Listen to me," Harris said, his tone firm but kind. "I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me. Can you do that?" The boys exchanged another glance, then nodded slowly. Harris knew this was just the beginning. The night was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The paper was clutched tightly in Kyle's hands, his knuckles white from the grip. Ben looked like he was ready to collapse under the weight of his fear. Without a word, the two boys turned and started walking back toward town, their steps heavy with dread. Harris waited until they were out of sight before stepping out from the shadows. He couldn't just leave this alone. Rick wasn't just exploiting these kids, he was putting the entire community at risk. Tampering with a gas pump was no small thing. One mistake, and it could cause a fire, an explosion, or worse. By the time Harris returned to the gas station, the parking lot was empty, save for the faint glow of the fluorescent lights. He locked the door behind him and made his way to the back office, his mind already turning over the possibilities. If Rick's operation was as organized as it seemed, this wasn't going to stop with one job. Harris needed to gather evidence, enough to not only protect those boys, but to take Rick down for good. He opened the drawer where he kept the station's extra security tapes, his fingers brushing over the labels. The cameras covering Pump 4 had been upgraded just last month, and Harris hoped they'd capture anything suspicious. He popped the most recent tape into the player and began fast-forwarding through the footage. There it was, just as he'd suspected. Kyle and Ben had been by Pump 4 earlier that evening. They hadn't done anything yet, but they'd lingered long enough to scope it out. Harris rewound the tape, watching their movements carefully. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. These weren't hardened criminals. They were kids, scared and out of their depth. But Rick was a different story. He was a predator, using fear and manipulation to get what he wanted. Harris's gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. Midnight was approaching fast, and he had no doubt that Kyle and Ben would be back soon, armed with Rick's instructions. The hum of the gas station lights bathed the empty lot in an artificial glow as midnight crept closer. Mr. Harris sat in the small office, his eyes glued to the monitors displaying the station's security feeds. His mind replayed the tension he'd observed earlier that evening. The nervous glances, hushed whispers, and the hesitant movements of Ben and Kyle as they argued near the park. The boys were clearly in over their heads, and the name Rick hung ominously in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Harris leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. He had no proof of what the boys were planning, but he didn't need much imagination to fill in the blanks. The rumors of fuel tampering and theft had been spreading across town for weeks, and the station had already shown subtle signs of being a target. Tonight felt different, though. There was a pressure in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, each second amplifying Harris's unease. He adjusted the camera angle on pump 4, ensuring he had a clear view of the area. If Ben and Kyle showed up, he'd be ready. The parking lot remained still, the silence almost oppressive. Harris glanced at his phone, debating whether to alert the authorities. But calling the police felt premature without concrete evidence. If Rick was as dangerous as the boys' fear suggested, tipping him off too early could put them, and others, at greater risk. Harris resolved to handle this himself, at least until he had more information. At 11:58 p.m., movement caught his eye. 2 figures emerged from the shadows at the edge of the lot. Ben and Kyle. They moved cautiously, their heads swiveling as they scanned the area. Harris's heart pounded as he watched them approach pump 4. Kyle carried a small bag, while Ben looked like he was on the verge of bolting at any moment. Harris grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the office, moving quietly toward the front of the station. He needed to confront them before they did something irreversible. As he reached the door, he paused, watching through the glass as the boys knelt by the pump. Kyle pulled something from the bag, a set of tools. Harris's stomach churned. This was it. He pushed the door open, the chime ringing softly in the night. The boys froze, their eyes wide with panic as Harris stepped into the light. "Stop," Harris said, his voice firm but calm. "Whatever you're about to do, don't." Kyle stood up, his hands raised defensively. "Mr. Harris, you don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Harris interrupted. "I know about Rick. I know he's forcing you to do this. But this isn't the way." Ben looked like he was about to cry. "We don't have a choice. He'll hurt our families if we don't." Harris took a step closer, his tone softening. "There's always a choice, and I'm here to help you make the right one. But you need to trust me." Kyle hesitated, his grip tightening on the tools. For a moment, it seemed like he might bolt, but then his shoulders slumped, and he dropped the bag to the ground. "Okay," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Harris nodded, relief flooding through him. "First, we call the police. Then, we make sure Rick can't hurt anyone ever again." The boys exchanged a glance, then nodded. Harris pulled out his phone, his mind already racing with the next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time that night, he felt like they had a fighting chance. Ben and Kyle moved cautiously, their steps hesitant and their eyes darting nervously over their shoulders. Harris felt a pang of sympathy as he watched them through the monitors. They weren't hardened criminals. They were scared kids, caught in the orbit of someone far more dangerous. Kyle carried a small bag slung over his shoulder, while Ben kept his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. They stopped near pump 4, exchanging hurried whispers. This is a bad idea, Ben said, his voice loud enough for Harris to catch snippets of the conversation through the monitors. We should just leave. And go where? Kyle hissed, setting the bag down. You know what Rick said. We either finish this or we're in worse trouble. Ben fidgeted, glancing back toward the street. What if we mess up? What if something goes wrong? Then we're screwed, Kyle replied bluntly. So let's not mess up. The sight of Kyle pulling tools from his bag was enough for Harris. He couldn't stand by any longer. He needed to stop them before they made a mistake that would tie them further into Rick's scheme, or worse, get someone hurt. Harris stepped out of the office, the faint creak of the door announcing his presence. Evening, boys! The reaction was immediate. Kyle froze, the tool in his hands slipping back into the bag. Ben jumped, his eyes wide with panic. For a moment neither of them moved, their expressions a mixture of guilt and fear. Mr. Harris. Ben stammered, his voice shaking. That's me, Harris said, crossing his arms as he approached. Now, how about you two tell me what you're doing out here at this hour? Kyle hesitated, his jaw tightening. Nothing, just fixing something. Harris raised an eyebrow, glancing at the bag of tools. Fixing something, huh? At midnight? At a pump that doesn't need fixing? Ben looked at Kyle, clearly unsure of how to respond. Kyle clenched his fists, trying to muster some semblance of confidence. We're not doing anything wrong, Harris sighed, softening his tone. Look, I know you're scared, but whatever Rick has you doing, this isn't the answer. You're smarter than this, both of you. Kyle's defiance wavered. He lowered his gaze, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You don't understand. He'll come after us if we don't do what he says. Then let me help you, Harris said firmly. You don't have to do this alone. Ben's voice trembled as he finally spoke up. He threatened our families. He knows where we live, where our parents work. If we don't do what he says, he'll... Harris held up a hand, stopping him. I know what kind of person Rick is, but fear only works if you let it control you. Right now you have a choice. Keep doing what he says, or let me help you take a stand. Kyle looked skeptical, his lips pressing into a thin line. And what can you do? He's got people watching. If he finds out, he won't, Harris interrupted. Not until it's too late for him to do anything about it. After a long pause, Kyle sighed and dropped his bag to the ground. Fine, we'll tell you, Harris nodded, motioning for them to follow him back into the office. Once inside, Kyle unzipped the bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Harris, his hands trembling slightly. This is what he gave us, Kyle said, his voice low. It's instructions for tampering with the pump. He said if we don't do it, he'll make sure we regret it. Harris unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the crude diagram and handwritten notes. His jaw tightened as he realized the extent of Rick's plan. This wasn't just about stealing fuel. It was about causing chaos, sending a message to anyone who might think about crossing him. This is serious, Harris said, his tone grave. If you'd gone through with this, it could have put a lot of people in danger. Ben looked down, his face pale. We didn't want to, but we didn't know what else to do. Harris placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, his expression softening. You did the right thing by telling me. Now, we're going to make sure Rick can't hurt anyone else. Kyle frowned. How? He's got people everywhere. If he finds out we talked... He won't, Harris interrupted. Not if we're smart about this. First, we need to gather evidence. Then we take it to the authorities. But we have to move carefully. Rick's dangerous, and he won't go down without a fight. The boys exchanged a glance, their fear still evident, but now mixed with a glimmer of hope. For the first time, they felt like they had a chance, a way out of the nightmare Rick had dragged them into. Harris leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about protecting the boys anymore. It was about taking down a man who'd been terrorizing the community for far too long. and Harris was ready to do whatever it took to make sure Rick paid for his crimes. Kyle handed the folded piece of paper to Harris with a reluctant glance at Ben, who nodded in silent agreement. Harris unfolded the paper and studied it. The diagram was crude but detailed, showing exactly how to disable Pump 4's safety mechanisms to allow fuel siphoning without detection. It was clear that whoever had drawn it knew the station's layout intimately. "This isn't the first time, is it?" Harris asked, his gaze shifting between the boys. Kyle shook his head. "No. He's had us scope out other stations, mess with their pumps. But it's not just about fuel." Harris frowned. "What do you mean?" Ben hesitated before speaking. "We've heard him talking on the phone. He's moving shipments. He uses the fuel pumps to hide it." "Shipments of what?" Harris pressed. "We don't know," Kyle admitted. "But he's been ramping up lately. Whatever it is, it's big." Harris folded the diagram and tucked it into his pocket. He'd heard enough to confirm what he already suspected. Rick wasn't just running a small-time operation. He was using the gas station as part of a larger, more dangerous scheme. "Here's what we're going to do," Harris said, his tone resolute. "You two are staying out of sight for the rest of the night. No contact with Rick. No sneaking back here. You leave everything to me." "But what about Rick?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. "He'll come looking for us." "Let him," Harris replied. "I've dealt with guys like him before. He doesn't scare me." Kyle didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but be careful. He's not bluffing when he says he'll hurt people." "I'll keep that in mind," Harris said, ushering them toward the back office. "Now go. And remember, you're not alone in this." With the boys safely tucked away, Harris turned his attention back to the monitors. His eyes flicked between the feeds, watching for any signs of Rick or his crew. The lot remained quiet, but Harris knew it was only a matter of time before Rick realized his plan wasn't going as expected. As the clock ticked past midnight, Harris leaned back in his chair, his jaw set with determination. He wasn't just protecting his station. He was protecting these boys and standing against the fear that Rick had used to control them. Whatever came next, Harris was ready. The early hours of the morning draped the gas station in a quiet, uneasy calm. The parking lot was empty, but Mr. Harris felt anything but relaxed. After his encounter with Ben and Kyle, he knew the night was far from over. Rick wouldn't let their defiance slide, and Harris had made himself a target by stepping in. Sitting in the dimly lit office, Harris reviewed the surveillance footage from the night. The boys' attempt to tamper with Pump 4 was clear on the video, but more concerning was the diagram they'd handed over. It wasn't just about siphoning fuel. The instructions hinted at something deeper, more calculated. A system designed for efficiency, not amateur theft. Rick was operating on another level, and Harris needed to figure out just how far the rabbit hole went. The soft chime of his phone pulled Harris from his thoughts. It was a text from Frank, his retired police friend. "Got a lead on Rick. Meet me at the diner, 6 a.m. Harris stared at the message for a moment, his gut tightening. If Frank had found something, it was likely serious. Rick wasn't the kind of criminal who left loose ends, and any information on him was hard-earned. He glanced at the clock. 4:15 a.m. There were still hours to go before sunrise, and Harris wasn't about to sit idle. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. The parking lot stretched out before him, silent and still. But Harris knew better than to trust the stillness. He walked to Pump 4, shining his flashlight over the base. The screws were slightly loose, just as the diagram had instructed, but nothing appeared tampered with. Harris crouched down, inspecting the pump for any signs of hidden mechanisms. Rick's instructions had been explicit, and Harris suspected there was more to this than a simple theft operation. As he ran his hand along the side panel, his fingers brushed against something unusual, a faint seam in the metal where there shouldn't have been one. Harris pulled out his multi-tool and carefully pried the panel open. Inside, nestled among The standard wiring was a small device with blinking lights. "What the hell?" Harris murmured, pulling back. The device was a GPS tracker, its tiny red light blinking steadily. Harris's mind raced. If Rick had planted trackers on the pumps, it meant he was monitoring them remotely. But why? Was it just for fuel theft? Or was something more sinister at play? Before Harris could investigate further, the distant rumble of an engine reached his ears. He turned off the flashlight and moved to the shadow of the building, watching as a pair of headlights approached. The vehicle slowed as it neared the station, its engine idling ominously. Harris's heart pounded as he recognized the rusted pickup truck from earlier. Rick was back. The truck came to a stop near Pump 4 and the driver's side door creaked open. Rick stepped out, his scarred face illuminated by the dim glow of the station's lights. He scanned the area, his movements deliberate and calculating. Harris held his breath, staying hidden in the shadows. He needed to see what Rick was up to. Rick walked over to Pump 4, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the loose screws. He crouched down, his hand reaching for the side panel. Harris's stomach dropped. If Rick discovered the tracker had been tampered with, it could put everyone in danger. But before Rick could open the panel, his phone buzzed. He straightened up, pulling it from his pocket and glancing at the screen. His expression darkened and he muttered something under his breath before climbing back into the truck. Harris watched as the truck sped off into the night, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Rick's sudden departure could mean only one thing. Something had gone wrong with his plan, and he was scrambling to fix it. Harris knew he had to act fast. He pulled out his phone and texted Frank. "Change of plans. Meet me at the station ASAP. We've got a bigger problem than we thought." As he waited for Frank's response, Harris returned to the office, his thoughts swirling. The GPS tracker, Rick's sudden appearance, and the boy's fear all pointed to a much larger operation. Harris wasn't just dealing with a petty criminal. He was up against a man who had built an empire on fear and control, and Harris was determined to bring it all crashing down. The dark SUV rolled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Harris held his breath, staying perfectly still. The vehicle stopped near the edge, and the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out. It was Rick. Even in the dim light, Rick's presence was imposing. He moved with calculated confidence, his sharp eyes scanning the lot. Harris could see him pull out a phone, the screen casting a faint glow on his face as he tapped a few buttons. Moments later, the tracker inside Pump 4 emitted a faint beep. Harris's heart raced. Rick wasn't here by coincidence. He was checking on his operation. The GPS tracker was more than just a monitoring tool. It was likely tied to a broader network, allowing Rick to control the pumps remotely or track stolen fuel shipments. Rick moved closer to Pump 4, crouching down to inspect it. Harris weighed his options. Confronting Rick now would be dangerous, but letting him leave without getting more information could be worse. Harris decided to wait, watching Rick's every move. As Rick worked, the faint sound of footsteps behind Harris made him freeze. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of another figure approaching from the shadows. It was one of Rick's men, a burly, tattooed enforcer carrying a flashlight. The man's beam swept across the lot, coming dangerously. Close to Harris's hiding spot. "See anything?" Rick called out, his voice calm but firm. "Not yet," the man replied, his light lingering on the ground near the station wall. "You sure they didn't screw this up?" Rick stood, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Those kids are scared. Enough to follow instructions. But we've got bigger things to worry about. Keep an eye out," the man grunted in response, continuing his search. Harris pressed himself closer to the wall, his pulse pounding in his ears. The enforcer's flashlight passed within inches of his position before moving on. Rick climbed back into the SUV and the enforcer followed. The vehicle's engine roared to life and it disappeared into the night, leaving the lot silent once more. Harris exhaled slowly, stepping out of the shadows. His mind was spinning. The GPS tracker, Rick's late-night visit, and the enforcer's search all pointed to something much larger than a local theft ring. Rick was running a well-coordinated operation, and Pump 4 was just one small piece of the puzzle. Harris returned to the office, pulling up the footage from the past week. He focused on Pump 4, noting every time the same dark SUV had appeared in the lot. The timestamp showed a pattern. Rick or one of his men visited the station every 2 or 3 days, always in the dead of night. As Harris studied the footage, he noticed another detail. The visits always coincided with delivery trucks arriving at nearby businesses. The connection was subtle, but it was there. Rick wasn't just stealing fuel. He was using the station as a waypoint for something bigger, perhaps smuggling goods or moving illegal shipments. Harris leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling over him. He couldn't confront Rick directly. Not yet. He needed more evidence, something that would expose the full scope of Rick's operation. Harris's thoughts turned to Ben and Kyle. The boys knew more than they realized, but their fear had kept them from speaking freely. Harris resolved to gain their trust fully and uncover what else they might know. If Rick had used them for other stations or deliveries, their information could be crucial. Glancing at the clock, Harris saw it was nearly 5:30 a.m. The diner meeting with Frank was fast approaching, and Harris knew he had to prepare. Rick's operation was bigger than he'd imagined, and if he was going to take it down, he needed allies. The gas station remained quiet as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. Harris stood by the counter, staring out at the empty lot. The events of the night had only deepened his resolve. Rick might think he controlled the game, but Harris was determined to turn the tables. As the chime of the station's door echoed in the stillness, Harris turned to see Ben and Kyle standing hesitantly in the entrance. Their faces were pale, their expressions filled with guilt and fear. "We couldn't sleep," Kyle admitted, his voice barely audible. We want to help." Harris nodded, his determination hardening. "Good, because we're going to need all the help we can. Get." The rising sun cast golden light across the diner windows, promising a peaceful morning in the town. Inside, however, the tension between Mr. Harris and Frank was anything but calm. Harris stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his mind racing with everything he had uncovered the previous night. Across from him, Frank leaned back in the booth, his expression unreadable as he processed Harris's recounting of Rick's activities. "So this guy, Rick," Frank said, his voice low and serious, "he's not just stealing fuel. You're saying he's using the station to mask something bigger?" Harris nodded, sliding the crude diagram across the table. "I'm certain of it. This isn't just about siphoning fuel. He's planting trackers, coordinating shipments, and using kids like Ben and Kyle to avoid detection. There's a pattern to all of this." Frank examined the diagram, his brow furrowing. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a local problem. This has the makings of an interstate smuggling ring." Harris leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I've seen his SUV show up multiple times, always around delivery schedules for nearby businesses. It's not a coincidence. He's moving something through this station, something he doesn't want anyone to see." Frank tapped his fingers against the table, his mind working through the possibilities. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. "I don't know yet," Harris admitted, "but whatever it is, it's big enough to make him keep a tight leash on those boys. He's using their fear to control them, Frank. That's what worries me the most." Frank's expression hardened. "If he's leveraging kids, this guy is even more dangerous than we thought. Have they told you anything else?" "Not much," Harris said, frustration creeping into his tone. "They're terrified of him, and I can't blame them, but I think they've seen more than they realize. If we can get them to open up safely, we might get the evidence we need." Frank nodded, his gaze steady. "Then that's where we start. But we need to be careful. If Rick catches wind of this, he'll shut it down. and he won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in his way. Harris clenched his fists, his resolve unwavering. I'm not letting him get away with this. Not while I can still do something about it. Frank leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. All right, here's what we'll do. First, we need to document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps, anything that ties Rick to this operation. Second, we need to get those boys to talk. If they've been involved in other jobs, they might know where Rick's storing his shipments, or who his contacts are. Harris nodded, his mind already racing with the next steps. And if we find something concrete? Then we take it to the authorities, Frank said firmly. But we need to make sure we've got enough to put him away for good. Half measures won't cut it with a guy like Rick. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their plans settling over them. Outside, the town was beginning to wake up, oblivious to the danger lurking in its shadows. Harris took a deep breath, his determination hardening. Let's get to work. Frank set the diagram aside and leaned closer. You've been playing this smart, Jim, but you need to be careful. A guy like Rick won't hesitate to retaliate if he feels threatened. Have you thought about what happens when he finds out you're onto him? Harris's jaw tightened. I have. That's why I need to stay ahead of him. We can't make a move until we have enough evidence to shut him down completely. Frank sighed, glancing out the window. I can call in a favor. A buddy of mine in the state police might be able to help. But we'll need something concrete to give him. Otherwise, we're just working off suspicions. We'll get it, Harris said with quiet determination. But I need time to get those boys to trust me fully. Rick's already spooked them enough to make them desperate. As the two men talked, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and Harris instinctively glanced up. To his surprise, Ben and Kyle walked in, their faces pale but determined. They spotted Harris immediately and hesitated for a moment before making their way to the booth. Frank raised an eyebrow. I take it these are the kids you mentioned? Ben, Kyle, Harris said, his tone gentle. This is Frank. He's someone we can trust. The boys exchanged a nervous glance before Kyle spoke, his voice shaky. We came to tell you something. About Rick, Harris nodded, his heart pounding. Take your time. What is it? Kyle took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting on the table. Rick's been talking about a shipment, something big. He's been on the phone with people we don't know, but he keeps saying it has to move through the station. Ben chimed in, his voice barely above a whisper. We heard him say it's the last one. He sounded nervous, like something was going wrong. Harris and Frank exchanged a glance. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. It was on the verge of unraveling, and Rick was desperate to see it through. Did you hear anything about timing? Frank asked, his tone firm but kind. Kyle hesitated before nodding. Tonight. He said it had to happen before midnight. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. Tonight. That gave them less than a day to prepare. Frank leaned back, his expression thoughtful. This might be our chance. If we can catch him in the act, we'll have everything we need to take him down. But what about us? Ben asked, his voice cracking. If Rick finds out we talked, he won't, Harris said firmly. You're not going back to him, not tonight, not ever. We'll keep you safe. Frank nodded. I can arrange for protective custody if it comes to that. But for now, we need you to stay out of sight and let us handle this. Kyle swallowed hard, his fear evident. You really think you can stop him? Harris placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. I don't think, I know. As the boys left the diner under Frank's watchful eye, Harris's mind raced. He needed to ensure that everything was in place for tonight's operation. Rick was smart, but his arrogance made him predictable. If the shipment was as important as the boys said, Rick wouldn't risk leaving anything to chance. He'd be there in person. Harris pulled out his phone and dialed Frank's number. Call your contact in the state police. Let them know we'll have what they need tonight. I'm going to make sure this ends here. Be careful, Jim, Frank warned. Guys like Rick don't go down without a fight. I know, Harris said, his voice grim. But this time, he's up against someone who fights back. Night fell over the gas station, bringing with it an eerie stillness. The usual hum of passing cars was absent, and the lot felt like the stage of a play waiting for its actors. Mr. Harris stood in the office, his eyes fixed on the security monitors. Tonight would end it all, one way or another. Frank's voice crackled over the radio. We're in position. State police are ready to move on your signal. Harris took a deep breath, his hand resting on the flashlight by his side. Let's do this. Frank's contact and the state police had mobilized, the team ready to move in once they had concrete evidence. Ben and Kyle were safely tucked away in a nearby safe house under Frank's protection. Now, it was just Harris, the quiet hum of the station, and the imminent arrival of Rick. At 11:45 p.m., the first sign of movement appeared. A dark SUV rolled into the lot, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Harris's breath slowed as he watched Rick step out, flanked by two of his men. The three figures moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. Harris had spent the afternoon preparing, ensuring the station looked as ordinary as ever. Pump 4 stood waiting, its hidden GPS tracker still active. Harris had also planted a second camera nearby to capture every detail of Rick's operation. From the monitors, Harris watched as Rick gestured to one of his men, who retrieved a large duffel bag from the SUV. The bag was placed beside Pump 4, and the man began tampering with the pump, following the instructions from the diagram Harris had recovered. This was it, the evidence they needed. Harris stepped out of the office, his movements deliberate. He didn't want to spook them too soon. As he walked into the lot, Rick's head snapped up, his sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of Harris. Well, well, Rick drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. Look who decided to join the party. Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about, Harris replied, keeping his tone calm. Seems like you've got a lot riding on tonight. Rick chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong, old man. That's not a healthy habit. Harris shrugged, stepping closer. Maybe I'm just curious. Or maybe I'm tired of watching you drag kids into your mess. Rick's expression darkened, his smirk vanishing. You've got no idea what you're dealing with. Before Rick could say more, a voice crackled through an earpiece Harris was wearing. It was Frank. We've got eyes on the shipment. State police are in position. Just give us the word. Harris didn't respond aloud, keeping his focus on Rick. You think you're untouchable, don't you? That no one can stop you? Rick took a threatening step closer. You don't scare me. You're just another stubborn fool who doesn't know when to quit. Harris glanced at the duffel bag, its zipper slightly open to reveal small, unmarked containers inside. What's in the bag, Rick? More fuel or something worse? Rick's patience snapped. He grabbed Harris by the collar, his face inches away. You want to play hero? Fine, let's see how far that gets you. Harris didn't flinch. He met Rick's glare with a steady gaze. You're done, Rick. It's over, Rick sneered, tightening his grip. You really think you can stop me? You're nothing but a washed-up gas station owner. Harris's voice was calm, but firm. Maybe. But I'm not the one who's about to get caught red-handed. At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed as state police vehicles surrounded the lot. Rick's men froze, their hands instinctively going up. Rick released Harris, his face a mask of fury. It's over, Rick, Harris said, stepping back. You're finished. Rick's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The state police moved in, their weapons drawn. Hands where we can see them, an officer shouted. Rick hesitated for a moment, then raised his hands, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. As the officers moved in to cuff him, Harris stepped aside, his heart pounding. Frank approached, clapping Harris on the shoulder. You did it, Jim. It's over. Harris nodded, watching as Rick was led away. Not yet. We still need to make sure Ben and Kyle are safe. And we need to find out what's in that bag. Frank glanced at the duffel bag, now in the hands of the police. Whatever it is, it's evidence, and it's going to put Rick away for a long time. As the chaos settled, Harris felt a wave of relief wash over him. The station was safe, the boys were safe, and Rick's reign of fear was finally over. Hero? Fine, but you're about to regret it. Rick snarled, his grip tightening on Harris's collar. Before Rick could act, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flooded the lot as state police vehicles surrounded the station. Rick froze, his grip on Harris loosening as officers emerged, weapons drawn. "Rick Sanders, put your hands where we can see them," a commanding voice ordered. Rick's men panicked. One of them bolted toward the SUV but didn't get far before officers tackled him to the ground. Rick, however, remained still, his eyes blazing with fury as he released Harris and raised his. "Hands! You set me up!" Rick spat, his voice venomous. Harris stepped back, smoothing his collar. "No, Rick! You set yourself up. You just didn't realize someone was watching." As officers secured Rick and his crew, Frank approached Harris, a satisfied grin on his face. "Nice work. We've got everything we need. Footage, the shipment, and witnesses ready to testify. He's done." Harris nodded, relief washing over him. "What's in the bag?" Frank knelt beside the duffel bag, unzipping it fully. Inside were small containers filled with a clear liquid. One of the officers examined a sample and confirmed what Harris suspected. The containers held a synthetic drug, ready for distribution. This wasn't just about fuel theft, Frank said grimly. He was using the station to move product across state lines. The fuel tampering was just a cover. As the police wrapped up their operation, Harris stood alone near Pump 4, staring out into the now empty lot. The adrenaline of the night began to fade, replaced by a heavy sense of responsibility. He had stopped Rick, but the damage that man had caused to the town and to boys like Ben and Kyle would take time to heal. Frank joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did good tonight. Those boys are lucky you stepped in." Harris shook his head. "I just hope it's enough. They've been through too much already." "They'll be okay," Frank assured him. "And so will this town, thanks to you." Next morning, the gas station was quiet again, the chaos of the night replaced by a tentative peace. Ben and Kyle returned, their faces brighter than Harris had ever seen them. They had a long road ahead, but with Rick out of the picture, they could finally start to rebuild their lives. Harris greeted them with a small smile, handing each of them a broom. "We've got a mess to clean up. You boys ready to help?" Kyle grinned, his usual bravado softened into something genuine. "Yeah, we're ready." As the sun rose higher, Harris felt a sense of hope settle over the station. He had fought for his town, his business, and the kids who deserved a better future, and for the first time in weeks he felt like he had won.